Good morning, everyone. My name is Joaquin Escobar. I'm Chair of the State Water Resources Control Board. Today is Wednesday, November 8th. It is 9:30 a.m., and I'd like to call this meeting back into order. I'll begin by introducing my fellow board colleagues. With me here today, virtually, will be joining us Vice Chair Doreen Diadamo. Here in person, we have Board Member Sean McGuire and Board Member Laurel Firestone. Additionally, we have our Executive Director, Eileen Sobek, our two Chief Deputies, Jonathan Bishop and Eric Oppenheimer, our Chief Counsel, Michael Offer. Our Clerk of the Board is Courtney Tyler, and assisting her today is Margie Argel and Michael Reed, and Eric Oppenheimer may not actually be joining us today. As you can see, this is a hybrid meeting. It is both with in-person and virtual components. If you're joining us virtually, you're viewing us to one of our two webcasts, either the YouTube live link or otherwise the Cal EPA video at calepa.gov. If you intend on commenting on any items today, though you should be on the Zoom platform, there is a link at the top of the agenda. There are instructions on how to get onto the platform. If you're having any challenges, though, please do just email the clerk of the board at board.clerk@waterboards.ca.gov, and she can help you get onto the platform. Once you are on the platform, your camera will be off. You'll be on mute until it is your opportunity to speak on the item you've indicated. For everyone in the room, good morning. Good to see you. We're here in Sacramento in the Cal EPA building. A couple announcements for us as well. Just to please observe the exits. If there happens to be an emergency, we'll calmly file out to Cesar Chavez Plaza and await further direction. Also, if you intend on commenting on any item today, there is a tablet or a laptop on the side here or a QR code in the back in order to sign up. And once you come up, please do state your name, any affiliation you have, and silence any phones just to be able to not have any interruptions during our discussion. With that, we had public forum yesterday, so we can get straight into our items. We have a tranche of informational items and really appreciate each one of these and look forward to the discussions. The first one is item number 8, which will be our Office of Operator Certification Program updates. Really glad to see you all. Looking forward to this discussion. Good morning. Good morning.
Morning, Chair Escobar, members of the board. My name is Keisha Kelly, Program Manager of the Office of Operator Certification in the Division of Financial Assistance. With me today, to my left, is Christine Gordon, Assistant Deputy Director, Valerie Gregory, who is the Office of Operator Certification Unit 1 Manager, and Julie Osborne, who is the program's legal counsel. Valerie and Julie switch seats on me. Today, I will be giving, next slide, please. Today, I will be giving a brief presentation. This informational item is to provide a status update on the Office of Operator Certification, including the recommendations that were made by the Drinking Water Operator Certification Program and Wastewater Operator Certification Program Advisory Committees, and the State Water Resources Control Board staff responses to those recommendations. The State Water Resources Control Board is responsible for administering the Drinking Water Operator Certification Program and the Wastewater Operator Certification Program. The Drinking Water Operator Certification Program certifies drinking water distribution operators and drinking water treatment operators. The Wastewater Operator Certification Program certifies wastewater treatment plant operators and classifies wastewater treatment plants. Both programs are governed by statute and regulation. Next slide, please. The next 3 slides highlight the program improvements made over this past year. Next slide. In January of this year, the Office of Operator Certification reorganized its workload by functionality to optimize resources, improve processes, workflow, and operational efficiency by balancing staffing resources and realigning workload. The Office of Operator Certification is composed of 2 units, and prior to this calendar year's reorganization, each unit performed all the functions related to either drinking water operator certification or wastewater operator certification. So as a result of reorganization, each unit now performs primary functions. Unit 1 performs all functions related to examinations and renewals, and Unit 2 performs all functions related to certification. In January of this year, the Office of Operator Certification resumed a hybrid work environment of 1 telework day per week. The Office of Operator Certification evaluates operational needs frequently to ensure the hybrid work schedule does not negatively impact work processes and processing times. Last year, processing times were up to 10 weeks, and over this past year, the Office of Operator Certification has worked diligently to improve processing times. On average, current processing times are within 30 to 45 days of receiving a completed application. Next slide, please. The Office of Operator Certification launched a customer service survey in March of this year to receive customer and stakeholder feedback. As of August 31st, 103 individuals have completed this survey and given an average overall rating of 3.5 out of 5 stars. Survey responses are assessed to improve customer service and identify any emerging issues. Survey results are provided to the program's advisory committees, the California Nevada section of the American Water Works Association, and the California Water Environmental Association on a semi-annual basis.
So I want to add also with the survey, we know that we have over 40,000 operators. While the 103 may be small, we are continuing to look at those surveys and hopefully that they will increase.
I really appreciate that engagement. As we'll talk further, this program is really critical in the face of the workforce development needs in the state, and just appreciate the improvements that have gone on, and especially the survey and real attempt to make sure we're taking the temperature, if you will, and seeing how we can continue to improve. So really appreciate that.
Next slide, please. In September, in coordination with the State Water Board's Division of Information Technology, the Office of Operator Certification launched phase 1 of an interactive online application portal that allows applicants to submit examination applications for grades 1 and 2 examinations for both drinking water and wastewater operator certification electronically. Through the portal, applicants may also update their contact information, review and resolve application deficiencies, and track application statuses. Subsequent phases of the portal will integrate higher grades and more complex certification and renewal applications as it is developed. All phases of the portal are projected to be completed in the calendar year 2025. Next slide, please. The next 3 slides provide a summary of subwork group recommendations made to the Drinking Water and Wastewater Operator Certification Program advisory committees. Next slide, please. On June 27th, the Office of Operator Certification held a joint advisory committee meeting at which 4 subwork groups made recommendations to both the Drinking Water and Wastewater Operator Certification Program advisory committees for consideration. The 4 subwork groups were as follows: guidelines on reporting drinking water operator experience, wastewater operator in training or OIT requirements and experience, One Water regime, Assembly Bill 1588, military work experience and education. Next slide, please. The subwork group's recommendations included utilizing a guidance document on reporting drinking water operator experience, modifications to the wastewater OIT requirement and experience, amending experience requirements for certified drinking water treatment operators at advanced water treatment facilities, and establishing clear processes and procedures for implementing Assembly Bill 1588 in recognizing military work experience and education. Next slide, please. While both advisory committees voted to approve all of the recommendations, they also acknowledged that some of the recommendations required further development or modification to meet legal requirements and that further discussion was warranted. Next slide, please. Next, I will summarize the Office of Operator Certification's response to the recommendations. Next slide, please. On August 29th, the Office of Operator Certification held a second joint advisory committee meeting at which feedback on the recommendations was presented to both the Drinking Water and Wastewater Operator Certification Program advisory committees. The Office of Operator Certification identified which recommendations were considered, which recommendations were not considered, and the priority for implementation. Next slide, please. The top recommendations considered include approval of a guidance document that outlines the Office of Operator Certification's process for evaluating and awarding experience credit for drinking water operators, including dual certificate holders. This will improve transparency in how the Office of Operator Certification reviews, evaluates, and awards operator experience credit, and it will assist operators with understanding what must be submitted with each application. And this recommendation is our priority. The second recommendation considered is modifying the OIT education requirement so that the required 6 education points may be earned after the operator and training certificate is obtained, but prior to expiration of the certificate. Implementation of this recommendation requires changes to the program's regulations. Next slide, please. The third recommendation considered is modifying the drinking water experience requirement to include experience at advanced water treatment facilities for certified drinking water treatment operators. Implementation of this recommendation also requires changes to the program's regulations. The Office of Operator Certification intends to begin regulation scoping in January 2024. And I also want to add for clarification that under the current draft direct potable reuse regulations, wastewater operators cannot operate direct potable reuse facilities. And the fourth recommendation considered is assessing the feasibility of providing reciprocity or an examination waiver to individuals with military experience in operation of drinking water and wastewater treatment plants. The Office of Operator Certification has been leading continuing discussions surrounding feasibility and implementation of that. Next slide, please. The Office of Operator Certification is not considering the recommendation to allow agencies the option to bypass the OIT certification requirement by establishing their own formal apprenticeship program and then seeking approval of the program from the Office of Operator Certification. After further discussion, the Office of Operator Certification and stakeholders are not in favor of this recommendation due to it being undetermined which agencies would benefit and the cost associated with implementing and administering an apprenticeship program, especially for small rural agencies. Next slide, please. The Office of Operator Certification will continue to meet with the advisory committees and sub-work groups as needed to keep them informed of implementation plans for the recommendations considered. And in addition, we will also continue frequent meetings with Cal Nevada AWWA and CWEA to continue to discuss action plans to address issues and concerns in terms of program updates, stakeholder engagement, workforce development, and alignment of operator certification policies and procedures with water industry changes. Next slide, please. Next slide. Over the years, the State Water Board has been contacted by some stakeholders expressing interest in having operator certification examinations translated into another language, primarily Spanish. At the August 29th Joint Advisory Committee meeting, the Office of Public Participation joined us and led a robust discussion regarding the potential policy and regulatory implications of the State Water Board offering translated examinations. The Office of Public Participation provided background and asked a series of questions. Next slide. The advisory committee members and other stakeholders expressed their issues and concerns with offering translated operator certification examinations, including concerns regarding public health, safety, the environment, resources, and equity. A consensus was not reached on the topic. The Office of Operator Certification and the Office of Public Participation will continue internal discussions to revisit the issues and identify the next step. This topic will be discussed during future advisory committee meetings to seek further input from the advisory committees and inform stakeholders of how the State Water Board will address these issues and concerns. Next slide, please. To close out the presentation, I will provide a few program statistics for certifications and examinations. Next slide. Here is a snapshot of the number of drinking water and wastewater operator certificate holders by grade and type as of June 30th of this year. As of June 30th, there were over 6,000 valid wastewater certificate holders. This number includes operator and training certificates, and a combined total of over 33,000 valid drinking water treatment and distribution certificate holders. And these totals are consistent with the totals presented last year. Next slide, please. Here's a snapshot of cumulative computer-based testing pass rates from the inception of computer-based testing in February 2021 through June 2023. I want to highlight that treatment grade 5 examination is an oral examination and not conducted via computer-based testing. The far right column contains historical pass percentages of paper and pencil examinations conducted prior to the implementation of computer-based testing. The computer-based testing pass rates are consistent with historical pass rates. Next slide, please. This concludes the presentation. However, before we proceed with taking questions, I would like to acknowledge all of my staff in the program and express my appreciation for all their diligent and hard work over this past year. I would also like to acknowledge and extend gratitude to our stakeholders, the sub-work groups, and all our advisory committee members for their time, participation, and contributions. Thank you, and we are happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Kelly. Thank you for your work and leadership amongst that as well. And thank you for those acknowledgements. I join you in them, especially the many operators and folks that are part of the advisory committee really coming together, bringing their best, working with us, and importantly, bridging across to the program. These really important changes that we've been needing. And frankly, COVID really pushed us into the digital computer-based space that we needed to really be. But I feel what it did as well is really kick off a really robust discussion around workforce development, how the operator certification can really continue to be a central important resource when it comes to how we continue to bring the best and brightest minds into the sector, and how they first encounter us as they get certified is a really important sort of, I think, sets the tone, if you will, for the work that we know we continue to do with them. Then on the policy side, as we have the many things that are going on here before us. So just thank you, Ms. Kelly, for that. My question is on the starting of the sort of review of the regulatory underpinnings of the program. Just kind of wondering, how much is it in statute that we have to then lean on further? So meaning we have to go to the legislature potentially for changes, or how much we'll be able to do kind of in our own steam, if you will, and just reviewing the regulatory language that we've adopted here. And then just wondering the kind of timeline ultimately. I know we're just kicking off and it's kind of hard to, I think, spell that out. And I don't want to kind of box us in too much, but just so that people can anticipate when something might really kind of mature and come before the board.
So we will be starting our scoping, and I think the scoping would also include what part do we need that we can just use the regulatory changes, and what part we're going to kind of look at statutory changes. So I think that's when we are going to start determining that. The timeline is coming up with the draft timeline through between January and June. And then I think that's when we will really start knowing what we're going to take forward in these packages, whether it would be a full package or a separate package, because we don't want to hold up changes that we can make now with changes that we may have to take a little bit more time to discuss.
That's fantastic. I really appreciate that. And so, yeah, kind of June timeframe coming back to understand what the real kind of what everything is shaken out, I guess, amongst the ideas and what we
Yes.
can kind of bucket into different places. That's fantastic timeline. Thank you. I don't have any further question. I'm interested to hear, what I know. We have a commenter and there will be further discussion from board members, but just huge thanks. This is, again, such a critical program, and it's been exciting to see the changes just this last year, let alone, last year's as we've really transitioned from COVID to in-person testing to digital testing. So thanks so much. Looking to fellow board colleagues. Board member Fires.
Thanks. I echo all of that, echo the thanks, and I think recognition for the huge amount of work and really good process and listening and work from stakeholders as well as staff. And I really just wanted to, in addition to supporting, the priorities that you set in terms of guidelines and then working through regulatory work, which is a lot of work on top of, the huge improvements just in processing time that we've seen is really incredible. And so I want to recognize that that's a huge amount of work, and I really support those priorities. And I think just looking forward, given especially that, some of these language access questions, and then in thinking about that there's more process and discussion that's needed. And also just thinking about our racial equity resolution, I would love to see if there's a way to fit in maybe a work group, a sub work group this coming year that might pull from the associations in the sector that really are doing a lot of leadership around racial equity and increasing diversity within the workforce in the water and wastewater sectors and treatment operators, just to help give us some recommendations on what we might be able to do to support those efforts. And I think there's some effort. I know a lot of research that's been going on through the SAFER program to try to identify workforce development folks and contacts and leaders. And I'm sure the advisory group that we have also has a lot of those folks, but that we could create a space for intentionally asking those folks from those sectors that are focused on this as well, including maybe the groups that we're working on wanting to have translation of exams, to help to have them be leading that space of what would be most helpful from us to advance that, and giving us recommendations that could be brought for more discussion with the advisory group. And hopefully that doesn't lay so much of the workload burden on staff and really acknowledges I think the space of wanting to partner with all the efforts going on within the drinking water and wastewater sectors on this shared value.
Thank you, board member. And agree, I know the California Municipal Utilities Association received a $4 million workforce grant, are in the middle of, I know they've talked to Joe and Andrew and Sue, and I think others, Sue Mossberg here from AWWA. And so I think to your point, there's this momentum around the discussion that we can really tap into. So I really appreciate that point. Anything, Vice Chair? Okay, great. I'd like to call up Sue Mossberg, our, I think, single commenter on the item here today. Good to see you. You may need to turn on the mic. It may be cold. There's a button on the top. Sorry. We let all our first commenters moonlight as technicians too. So.
I'm usually not first. Well, hello, and thank you for the invite to come and speak. I'm Sue Mossberg, Executive Director of the California Nevada section of the American Water Works Association, and representing our 5,000 plus water professionals, of which over 470 are water utilities. It seems like the last couple of times I've been here, it's been to say thank you. So in a way, I'm here again to recognize the hard work of staff and really the ear of the Water Board to listen to the concerns. Cal Nevada AWWA has been around for like 100 years, a long time, supporting water professionals in the industry. And about 50 years ago, there was a voluntary certification program spooled up for treatment operators, recognizing that education and experience benchmarking was a good thing for this industry and the protection of public health. And those programs ultimately did turn over from Cal Nevada AWWA, and I think in the wastewater realm, from the wastewater side of the house, our peers, CWEA, to the Water Board for administering those programs. And there was a time when we were a little cautious about what that might mean and watched and tried to participate from the sidelines. And I'll say the last 2 years has been an amazing transition and step forward in collaboration. So I just wanted to share, for those who maybe haven't been following it for the last 2 years, a step back a couple of years to where we were and how far we've actually come to today. We came before you as CWEA and Cal Nevada AWWA with some comments from our membership, and those comments I'm sure were pretty hard to hear. And on May 10th, 2022, which I think was one of the first meetings of the Water Board came back after COVID, we had a really long night. I think it was one of the longest meetings up until maybe a recent one related to water use efficiency. But it was a long meeting. And even in the wee hours of the evening, you welcomed us and welcomed our presentation, which punched a few holes in the program and exposed some things that maybe weren't the best to hear. And you took to heart some of our recommendations. And so I just want to say thank you for those. And again, for those who haven't been following the last 2 years, a real quick synopsis. At that point in time, we did praise you and staff for embracing computer-based testing and recognizing what technology could do in that realm. We offered thanks for supporting and providing staff to our various conferences and meetings and symposiums so that there could be that one-on-one listening at the regional level for folks who couldn't necessarily come and have those discussions with staff in person here in Sacramento. We also praised you for taking interest overall as a Water Board in operator certification and workforce development, and really taking a look at those programs and what that means to the pipeline of workforce for tomorrow in this industry. Then we also had some items that we said, there needs to be some work in these areas, and we made some recommendations. So we came before you and talked about process times and the fact that those process times were really extended. I think they were extended going into COVID, and they just got longer through COVID. And we shared with you the impact on the workforce. And we made some strong recommendations about getting a handle on those times and reducing them down to something that was in that 30 to 45-day window. We also talked to you about the relationship of the advisory committees that had been spooled up and the perception of some people on those committees that their voices weren't necessarily being heard, even though they were trying to voice the concerns of the agencies and the water treatment operators and distribution operators. We made some suggestions about doing a management reset and about realigning potentially some of the work that had come a little bit unbalanced between the wastewater side of the house and the drinking water side of the house. We also talked to you about the experience requirements and the fact that there were some challenges with people being able to document appropriately what the work experience was related to the certification, so they could in fact be approved to get those certifications. We talked to you about the questions that had come up about process and documentation and what was appropriate and how do we document that as an industry or as an agency. And we gave some suggestions about reciprocity, about the military community, and how we could align their experience with the requirements that are legislatively and regulatorily set. We shared with you some of the challenges as far as the paperwork process and the confusion in those that maybe aren't as familiar with this industry about how they document their experience and their education on those applications. And we talked to you in general about just how do we make this connection when we're in this one water community now of, combining drinking water and wastewater and reuse and all of those things that make up advanced water treatment operations. And you listened, you directed staff to work with industry. Staff took those actions and moved forward. Originally in our request back in May of 2022, I don't think even we envisioned what the opportunities would be and what the level of interest that staff would put to what would then be a huge amount of work in 2023 to address those issues. I will share that even in preparing some comments for today, I went back and looked at the original recommendations and the timeframe that had been developed. And originally we were looking at some short-term, mid-term, long-term recommendations and solutions. And when we looked at long-term, we were looking at many years out. We were looking at 2 years plus. We are already seeing accomplishments in those long-term asks, and many of the midterm and short terms have been accomplished. So it's been coming up on 2 years, and we're already you're making great progress. I will say as we come before you, there's a couple of things that, like anything else, there's still work to do. I think the staff comments today and some of the items that they pointed out as far as continuing to get participation in the survey is an area that Cal Nevada, AWWA, and CWEA, CMUA, and the other professional associations can all work together to increase that participation level so you can hear from the community that's being served by the program. I think there's opportunities to continue to improve the online application portal. It was amazing to see how quickly that was able to be spooled up once the effort was put towards it. And the community has really embraced it and is recognizing that that is not only the wave of the future, but it's a good thing to have. And I'll just continue to share that the advisory committees have done great work, and the level of support that has been received from staff in the ear to address the issues that are brought forward has really been amazing. So again, I've come to you a couple of times and said thanks, but that's a great place to be in, and it's because of all the good work. So thank you.
Thank you. Just appreciate, I know, given the scope of our mission, the need always, I know, for better resource, that we can't possibly do everything perfectly here, and always open to knowing when there is a real need to focus in, and the program needed that bit of focus, obviously. And it's, here with great humility that we take all feedback, positive or negative, and always good to hear the thanks as well. So just appreciate that and know that we have a lot of opportunity, to your point, as we continue to build off of this momentum, to just continue to build that incredible workforce that we know we need to push us into what are, a lot of exciting opportunities when it comes to managing our water better in the state, and need those best and brightest. And the energy sectors out there, the financial sector, transportation, everyone else is needing those same minds. And, we're biased, I think, in this room, but the water sector is the best place you can be right now to really be exercising a lot of creative thought, and really appreciate everyone's efforts in here to continue to build this program. So thank you for that. Really appreciate it. And look forward to what I know is going to be further work on this. And would look forward to, on this item, having a get back probably in June-ish timeframe, it sounds like, maybe, just to come back, circle back, and kind of start to communicate back out where we are. But folks need more time or whatnot, we'll definitely allow for that. But looking forward to what I know will be follow-up. So thank you, Ms. Mossberg. Really appreciate it.
So, Chair, I would suggest that we ask the folks to come back with an executive director's report in June timeframe on the progress, and based on that, we can determine if we want to schedule
that's fair.
Information item.
Appreciate that. Okay, I think that wraps up. Unless looking to fellow board colleagues, if there's any further discussion, Incredible thanks, incredible work. Really appreciate it. Looking forward to further. That closes out this informational item and now brings us to our next item number 9, the site cleanup sub-account program status update. Give a moment for folks to transition.
As we're getting ready, I also wanted to express my appreciation. It's one of those things you realize how important it is to get great leaders and managers in these key positions and what a difference it makes. I mean, how many government programs turn around so quickly, the perception in such a short period of time. So a lot of credit goes to, Christine and Keisha and Valerie for leading the charge and, being open to feedback and, not taking it personally, but looking at it as an opportunity to build and improve and do a better job of serving, our stakeholders and the people of the state. So I'm just very proud of that.
Completely agree and appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay, good morning, Chair Esquivel, members of the board. I'm Joe Karkoski. I'm the Deputy Director of the Division of Financial Assistance. So today we're here to give you an update on the site cleanup sub-account program. So joining me is Cheryl Prowl with the Division of Water Quality. Julie Osborne decided to hang around from the last item, so she'll advise us on this one. And then Craig Sanchez, who's in the site cleanup sub-account program within DFA. So as part of the board resolution that was adopted in April, you asked us to come back to you in November. So we're here. And I thought one of the things we do before we get to some of the recommendations and thoughts we have as a follow-up to that board resolution, be helpful for Cheryl to kind of give a broader context on the site cleanup program. It's very similar to our other programs. The funding part is a part of it, but our regulatory efforts really sort of drive the improvements. So I thought providing that overall context can help as we get into the policy discussions around where we might want to go in the future with the site cleanup sub-account program. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it to Cheryl.
Great. Thank you for that introduction, Joe. Next slide. So I am Cheryl Prowl, the supervisor of the UST and cleanup programs section in the Division of Water Quality. And this slide gives you an introduction to the site cleanup program. We currently manage over 5,000 contaminated sites, and these sites range from chemical plants or large industrial facilities to small family-owned businesses like dry cleaners. In addition, based on business types and disposal histories, there's likely over 17,000 additional sites statewide that may have had spills or releases of chemicals that warrant investigation and cleanup to protect human health, but these sites have not yet become part of our process. All of our cleanup sites are disproportionately in disadvantaged communities, and I'll show you demographics about that disparity on some of the upcoming slides. Because of the range of sites in the program, the costs for investigation and cleanup can vary greatly, but typically range from somewhere between $1 to $10 million per case. And for all of our current open cases, we anticipate the cost for cleanup will exceed $12 billion. Unlike the underground storage tank cleanup program, where costs for investigation and cleanup are reimbursed by the Underground Storage Tank Fund, the site cleanup program predominantly operates on a polluter pays model, where the owner or operator of the facility pays for the investigation, cleanup, and reimburses the regional boards for their oversight time. However, many sites, like dry cleaners, are small family-owned businesses that lack the resources to fully address spills and releases caused during their operations. We estimate that approximately half of our sites need at least some assistance for funding. And one of the few opportunities that they have is the site cleanup sub-account. And of the sites in need of funding, the site cleanup subaccount has only been able to fund approximately 2% of these cases. This puts SCAP in the position of prioritizing or spreading resources among many worthy projects. And as we continue to bring the suspected sites into the program, we anticipate this need to grow, and it may be as much as $65 billion. Next slide. The foundation of our site cleanup program is State Board Resolution 9249. This provides structure to our authority to require cleanup and abatement of discharges under Water Code Section 13304, and it requires that we promote attainment of background water quality or the best water quality which is reasonable if background water quality cannot be restored. It also creates the systematic process that our case managers use to require investigations, work plans, completion reports to ensure that the process is protective of human health. Next slide. The next set of slides show some demographics of the environmental justice implications of the site cleanup program and how the polluter pays model has led to structural disparities in our remaining caseload. Especially, the disparities are great between cases that are actively being worked on and cases that are inactive. Cases become inactive for many reasons, but the most common is that the discharger lacks the ability to pay for the cleanup in our oversight time. This slide shows the Callan virus screen scores for our active cases on the left and the inactive on the right. Callan virus screen is a metric that ranks the vulnerability of each census tract in the state based on pollution burden and population characteristics like poverty or linguistic isolation. The dark wedges represent the number of cases in the least vulnerable 75% of communities, and the light blue wedges are the most vulnerable 25%. This is showing that there are a disproportionate number of cases in the most vulnerable communities, and the impact is even more for the inactive cases. Next slide. This is a very complex slide, and I'll try to focus on a few key issues here. It shows the race demographics based on census tract data for sites in just the most vulnerable 25% of communities. The outer ring is the racial demographics for the open active cases. And you can see that the orange wedge for white communities is substantially smaller than the 41% of the population that identifies as white. And the purple wedge for Hispanic or Latino is disproportionately large, indicating that there's a disproportionate effect on those communities by the remaining sites. And the inner ring is the inactive cases, and this disparity is even greater. Next slide. This slide, while less pronounced, shows that there are similar trends when we parse the data by disadvantaged community status, which is based on average income levels in the census tract. The dark blue wedges show severely disadvantaged communities, orange disadvantaged, and gray are communities with no designation. Next slide. And with that, I'll turn it back to Joe.
Okay, thank you, Cheryl. That was really great. So I hope everybody caught as we were going through those, the overall scope in terms of the site cleanup program. You know, we're talking about thousands of active and well over 1,000 inactive cases. So that hopefully will provide some context as we go through and we talk about the funding we have available. So I'll start with the eligible projects. It's fairly broad. You know, it's both surface and groundwater contamination for investigation or remediation of harm or threat of harm to human health, safety, and the environment. And both for existing or threatened contamination. So as we go through, you'll notice we do focus a lot on potential groundwater impacts. Next slide, please. So some of the requirements that the sites must be subject to a regulatory directive unless it's infeasible to issue an order or directive. The responsible parties have to lack sufficient financial resources to perform the required work. As Cheryl was saying, we primarily use a polluter pays model. And public agencies who are not RPs may also qualify for grants. So the statute doesn't have priority criteria or funding criteria. These are factors to be considered. So whether the location is in a small or financially disadvantaged community, the degree of threat of contamination to human health, safety, and the environment. We are supposed to expressly consider cost and potential environmental benefit of the cleanup. Whether there are other sources of funding, whether it's from the responsible party or elsewhere. And then there's sort of the catch-all, anything that you all think we should consider as part of the funding determination. Next slide, please. And this provides some context for the amount of resources that are available to the regional boards to help oversee these sites and site cleanup subaccount program. So again, with the polluter pays model, that's a cost recovery, right? So the funds aren't coming from the general fund, they're actually coming from the polluter. So these funds are available to help with those sites where they're not in cost recovery. And in general, this graph is showing kind of the trend from the beginning of the program around 2015, focus a lot on those source investigations to transitioning more to overseeing grants and contracts. Next slide, please. So we've got about $130 million in spending authority, roughly between what we have from the site cleanup subaccount from prior fiscal years, current fiscal year, and then general fund appropriation that we're tapping into. So our best estimate is that would fund about 50 new projects over a 10-year period. And again, contextually, it's about 5 or so per year, and there are thousands of inactive sites, and assuming about $5 million per project. The list that we brought before you in April had, just about 280 different sites on that list, both legacy ones and new ones. And then based on the methodology we had at that time, about half of those were considered to be fundable. And again, so everybody knows being on the fundable list doesn't guarantee funding. It just means there's a threshold that's been reached that we could potentially fund the project. Next slide, please. Since the program started, we've had about $150 million that we've dedicated to a variety of sites. So primarily 79 investigation remediation through grant, and then we have some sites that we're able to fund through contracts. So that can be when we haven't yet identified the responsible party, or maybe there's a recalcitrant responsible party. We're able to contract with our colleagues at Department of General Services. So the good news, the governor signed AB 1115, which extended the underground storage tank cleanup fund for another 10 years, which also is where the annual funding for the site cleanup subaccount program comes from. So we have those funds essentially secured through 2035. We did have that one-time funding from the Budget Act of 2021. That's where there's a combined groundwater cleanup, water recycling pod, and the board made a decision to take a portion of that funding and dedicate it to the site cleanup subaccount program. Okay, next slide, please. Just want to give you an update. One of the board resolution items, I think this was one of the resolutions that came about as we were meeting, was to look at those legacy projects, and you gave authority to me to review those and make a decision on whether they should be included in the fundable list, although their scores would have put them below that cutoff threshold. So of the projects that 25 applicants that had received funding, there are about 14 that we added to the fundable list. So that's for a variety of reasons. Sometimes There was some additional information that was provided that suggested the score should have been different, so we changed that. There was also, we had the term as a project at a critical juncture, so we didn't want to just stop and leave them hanging if we're close to getting to closure. So there are about 14 of those, or 5 that we didn't make a decision on because they have a current grant that is active. So we want to see the results of that work. We had no response and then a few no's. And again, this is just puts those on the fundable list. It's not a decision to fund at this point. Next slide, please. But we have been committing funds since we met in April, so about 15 grants, around $35 million, and 1 contract for a relatively small amount. We're currently going through a process, and we're continuously reviewing projects and committing funds, and we're close to committing a pretty good amount of contract funds to a number of projects in focusing initially on the LA region, and I believe also region 2 as well. Okay, next slide, please. Again, that one of the things we look at when we're managing the funds we have available is we're looking at all of those sites that are have already received grant funding. So you can see most of them are actually in those earlier stages, site investigation or interim remedial action. So we're very aware of that. We want to make sure that we have funding available to get to that remedial action phase with those projects. So we've got a little more than a quarter that are in that kind of hopefully final phase of cleanup. Okay, next slide, please. And as a reminder of kind of the overall funding cycle, it's not uncommon for us to have a contract initially to help identify responsible parties, further characterize the contamination at the site. Then the responsible party will often come forward, get a grant to do that additional site investigation, do some interim remedial measures. Maybe there's a source area you can excavate, mitigate that vapor intrusion risk. Develop the remedial action plan, then they'll come back to us for another grant to fund that remedial action plan. If all goes well and everybody, we characterize the site correctly and thoroughly and anticipated what was needed for the remedial action, they won't come back to us for another grant, but it's very difficult to anticipate, the extent of these plumes a lot of times, the level of effort that's really going to be required. So we'll often see another grant request after that. And that's where, we end up having some pretty significant decisions on, are any additional funds going to be sufficient to achieve closure, or should we just try to mitigate the human health and environmental risk, but maybe not get to that kind of background that is a driver for 9249. Okay, next slide, please. So, as I referred to, the board adopted its resolution in April. That was after about 7 years we had been relying on the original site cleanup subaccount resolution. We're also considering the racial equity resolution and action plan that the board had worked on as we're implementing the program and evolving the program, and the 2023 strategic work plan that directed us to prioritize funding of SCAP projects in disadvantaged and environmental justice communities. And as a reminder, we will be coming to you again in early part of next year, since annually we need to come to you to review those applications and adopt that fundable list. Okay, next slide, please. The methodology that the board adopted essentially has an equal weighting between EJ, DAC considerations, and human health and environment, plus some additional consideration if the project is in a small community. So the board adopted the comprehensive and fundable grant list, as I referred to before. There's also a list of potential sites that would receive assistance through contracts. We adopted a new ranking methodology. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute here. And then delegated a number of things, including revisions to that fundable list to me or my designee. Next slide, please. So the scoring, we used a mostly quantitative method. Again, human health, safety, and the environment is a big portion. Small community DAC and environmental justice makes up the rest of the score. But we also, again, look at that, cost and potential environmental benefit and other sources of funding. So that's kind of a separate analysis that our team does in conjunction with the regional board. Next slide, please. I won't go through too many of the details, but just to point out, I know one of the things we're going to be looking at and considering is having a minimum score, especially on the human health and safety side. But just as a reminder, even the minimum score is going to be challenging for us to choose because like in the current rubric, there's 1 point if you're up to an order of magnitude above the MCL. So that's already pretty high, right? We also have factors related to indoor air risk and proximity to surface water and drinking water wells. Next slide, please. And, again, we're to address some of the disparities that Cheryl pointed out, we're giving a lot of points and credits if a site is in a disadvantaged or severely disadvantaged community. And also, as you can see, give credit for being in an environmental justice community based on what quartile they're in per CalEnviroscreen. Okay, next slide, please. So that kind of gives the background. We also, per the board's direction, we formed a stakeholder group, met a couple of times. So I'll go through some common themes we heard from the stakeholder group. So we weren't asking for consensus recommendations. So these themes represent, 2 or more members of the group providing some input. So what we heard is 1, prioritize use of the SCAP funds for redevelopment, consider potentially separate funding tracks, 1 track that could have a DAC EJ focus and 1 that would be human health and environment focused. We had recommendations to more expressly consider sensitive receptors and different exposure pathways. So sensitive receptor might be if the site's close to a resident or school. We had some recommendations to take a more granular look at disadvantaged communities. So for example, who might be served at a given site? So if there's any services being provided to low-income households, as an example, include some more professional judgment in the health risk evaluation, and then we had a call for some folks who thought we should rank sites higher if there's limited data. Okay, next slide. And I know you've heard about this last time. It was quite a bit. We'll may hear about it some more today, is to continue funding sites until closure is achieved. That was one of the themes, I'd say strongly held theme. Also, consideration of establishing some SCAP cleanup goals. So, we have 9249, still have to, there's that framework that the RP has to work within and the regional boards work within, but the funding decisions could be different in terms of what the contribution from the State Water Board might be. There are calls to increase community engagement, including, providing some resources and funding to allow local community members and groups to be more involved, and call to increase program funding. Next slide, please. So now I'll get to some of our recommendations based on the feedback we heard, as well as kind of our own internal discussions and deliberations. We do think there's some room to modify the ranking and score with respect to how we consider soil vapor. So previously we would only use soil vapor data if there were no indoor air data available. Now we're looking at how to incorporate soil vapor data more expressly into the methodology. So when I'm going through these, we're not thinking of recommending changing the balancing, that 50-50 weighting. It's more within that human health and safety and environment score, making modifications within that. Also look at modifying and more expressly considering proximity to like residences, schools, or the use of the site. So we're taking into account sensitive receptors. And then if, say, the site is near a domestic well community, considering the number of the drinking water supply wells that are impacted, or if there's an actual impact to surface water. Next slide, please. We do want to include a minimum human health and environment score. We're not sure yet where we're going to land, but certainly if that score is 0, it doesn't make any sense for it to be on the fundable list. We would never fund a project that had no risk, but the way, it can look a little quirky where there's a high score because of DHC EJ considerations and really low or minimal human health score. So I think that was a issue that was brought up before, and we're looking at that to see what might make sense for that minimum score number. Next slide, please. I think the other kind of bigger issue that we're wrestling with, so we don't have a specific recommendation, we just think we need to signal a little more clearly how far we're going to go with funding any particular site. Because again, there are always going to be trade-offs, right? If we provide a lot of funding to one site, that means that funding is not available to other sites, even other sites that may be partway or fairly well through the process of cleanup. So we're trying to manage our portfolio of projects and funding and being able to signal in advance as much as we can to those folks who come into the program what they can expect. Because I think that's a lot of what you heard before is like that, those expectations. It's like, well, I'm in the list, why aren't I getting funding? Or once I'm in the program, why don't I get funding until we go to completion? So it's not because we don't want to do that. It's because we have sort of these realities that we're confronting. So Chair Esquivel, did you want to say something? Okay. So there are a couple different ways where we're thinking about this. One is, which I think would be provide the greatest clarity from managing the portfolio, is just to say, okay, you only get up to $5 million or $7 million. And this is not uncommon. We've done it before, like, our small community drinking water, wastewater, where, it's been actually baked into like the propositions where it says, no more than $5 million. Now we expanded that because we got additional resources, but when we've been resource limited, that's been, choice we've made in other programs. So it makes, of course, the cost more certain, the maximum cost, might drive folks to be as efficient as possible and prioritize a little differently. But we could also be left with not achieving cleanup goals, or maybe not even mitigating the main human health risks. Okay, next slide, please. Then there are couple other different ways of thinking about this in terms of maybe tying it to some cleanup levels. One would be just mitigate that human health and environmental risk, which may not get you to background, may not even get you to, say, the MCL in the aquifer per se, but if we mitigate the risk to, say, downstream wells, we could do that. But you'd still be leaving some contamination potentially at the site, which might restrict the use of the site currently or in the future. The other potential approach, which is essentially, I'd say, what we're doing currently, is remediate until the cleanup goal is achieved, or it's no longer cost effective, right? Where somebody comes to us with a proposal for some additional funding, and we just see there's just going to be an incremental cleanup and it's hard to see where the actual cleanup goal is going to be achieved. And then the last one is basically remediate until the regulatory agency cleanup goals are met. Now, of course, there's it's a zero-sum game for any of those choices, right? It's like if you go until the cleanup goals are met, there's potential you could spend 10, 15 or more $1 million on a given site. And then the next folks that come to us or may already be in the program, we may just be tapped out at that point. Okay, next slide. Oh, go ahead.
Not maybe, we will be, knowing just with
Right.
the sites that are out there, the $12 billion need and our, very small amount. There's just no way around it, unfortunately.
Yeah, thanks. And, I did want to, point out or remind everybody when Cheryl was presenting her slide, she was using billion numbers, and here we're talking millions, right? So large difference, 1,000 times. So some other policy considerations that might be able to help to some extent as we go through, evaluating projects. I know this is very wordy, but basically what we're getting at for this one is when we have an entity that comes to us, we're generally evaluating the financial condition of that entity, right? Like what assets does that entity have? What's their revenue stream, their net revenue? So, and an entity like a limited liability corporation may only own that contaminated property. So you look at the entity itself may not have any ability to pay. So one of the policy considerations, and again, we don't have a recommendation per se, is that some applicants may have the ability to obtain funding from other sources. So that's one of those considerations. That could require a much deeper dive or, having applicants reveal more information than they currently are. So, for example, the members, partners, shareholders of an entity, we might more have them provide a more express demonstration that they don't have the ability to come up with capital or a loan from other sources, or that maybe they have some insurance that could be available for the investigation or cleanup cost. So, Julie, did you want to say anything about that, or we covered that one? Okay. Okay. All right. Thanks. And then next slide, please, for some other policy considerations. So another thing that we see as we're reviewing these projects and they're coming in is we're using that kind of smallest census designation. So you're as close to the neighborhood level as you can kind of get using census data. And but it can lead to, and again, this is like trying to get some input from the board on how you'd like us to consider disadvantaged community status, right? So the statute doesn't get into the details of how to do that, but there are a couple, there's an alternative way to do it from our current way of doing things. So for example, I give the example of Fresno has a median household income of 57,000, right? And Fresno is a huge municipality, but they're considered disadvantaged. Santa Monica has, as you'd expect, a higher median household income, not disadvantaged. But there are neighborhoods, census block group that we recently funded a project that is disadvantaged. So there are different ways of kind of thinking about that, right, from a policy side as well. Community that maybe has more resources in general, they might be able to use some of their funds to support the cleanup. Versus a community that generally doesn't have as many resources because their municipality has a much lower household income level. So again, I would say we're as staff kind of agnostic. Just want to raise this to the board as something to be considered. Okay, next slide, please. So some of our next steps based on what we hear today. We'll finish up our work on some proposed modifications to the rank and scoring, potentially as well to the resolution. We'll meet with the regional board and our DWQ colleagues to discuss those proposals. We'll go to the stakeholder group as well prior to coming back to the board in first quarter of next year with some proposed changes. Next slide. So that's all I had. Oh, sorry, Jonathan, I forgot.
That's okay.
Take
I was
heed.
letting you were on a roll, so.
Thanks.
Thought I'd wait until the end to jump in. I think Cheryl and Joe did a great job of setting the stage, but I kind of want to bring it back to the main question. There isn't a way for us to fund all the sites that are worthy of being funded. And that's just the way it is. And so we really have three choices. We can continue as we have been, and at some point, we'll run out of money and sites will be where they are. And that's really, if once you get into the program, we keep funding you. We can, so that's one option. And that's essentially the default option. The second option is we can set a specific amount of money from the beginning, not based on anything but a dollar amount. That has worked really well in things like the underground storage tank program or our grants and loans programs, because it lets people know where they have to find other money. It's not as appealing in the site clean and in the SCAP program, because if they have other money, they are not in the program. That's the first essential criteria: is are they do they have funding to do this? So what that really says is we are going to clean up a site to a certain dollar amount, no matter what the outcome is for the community or for the site. The third option is we can set a goal for cleanup, and Joe went through the different iterations of that. But the reality is, 2 and 3 are what we're doing right now, to some extent. We'd be more explicit in 2 than we are today, saying, we're going to clean this up until you show us that we've kind of reached the economic threshold where it makes sense to continue cleaning up. Or we could depart from that and say, unlike all our cleanup programs that are based on protection of groundwater, we're going to base this on protection of exposure, which is not the way we normally do things, but we are moving in that direction with the vapor intrusion, which is based on exposure, and make a clear distinction that SCAP, because it is a funding of last resort, essentially not designed to protect the resource. That's what our 9249. Thank you. I always mix those up. 9249 is about. It's about the idea that human-made contaminants like volatile organics are not natural. There is no background, and you should be cleaning those up as to non-detect if you can, background if you can't, and the best you can do. But that's generally, I think Sean would say, in engineering, that last 10% costs much more than the first 90%. And so what we're really saying is that as staff, we're going to be thinking about this. And at this point, we don't have a recommendation for you, but I would like us to bring a recommendation in our next update to the list, but it'll be a hard decision. No matter what we recommend or what you decide, we are leaving out communities and people that need help. And that's not a place that anyone wants to be. And when we make it a specific, explicit decision, it makes it, even harder, because we are going to have folks that are going to come in and say, I inherited this from my dad. He was his whole life doing this, and now I can't clean it up, and you're not helping me. And so I know I'm being harsh, but I really want you all to be thinking about this over the next 6 months so that we can be deliberate in our decision as opposed to default. Thank you.
Thank you as well for that. I appreciate that. And, I know we have time here to somewhat land on something, but I don't know. I keep hoping that we find some greater resource as well, so that, you know, we can have a more cogent discussion around where we can land. But I think we have to assume we have the resources we have now for this. And it's not easy. You know, this prioritization we do in all of, as we've noted, in all of our funding programs. We have way much more demand than we do actual resource on the state revolving funds, on all of the other programs. So, you know, this prioritization that's come now to, I mean, we've already taken a step in even having this prioritization discussion with the program. And, you know, now it really does leave us with a really important need to just communicate clearly. And we see that, and we'll hear, I know we have a number of commenters here, so I'm looking forward to hearing their thoughts on how best we equitably and fairly go about this. But I have a hard time putting a cap, because this is unlike the SRFs and other you know, water recycling grants or, you know, septic to sewer work we're doing. This is a program of last resort. It's a different space, and I have a hard time necessarily saying, let's just do a hard cap that leaves just as much folks kind of halfway in the water as going about, you know, saying that we can clean up all the way to background or wherever, and similarly leaving everyone, because of the lack of resource, a bit dead in the water. So for me, it's somewhere in the middle there. I don't know exactly what, you know, those and to your point with vapor intrusion discussions already, maybe there's a little of a model there where it is something in between to background, the full sort of you know, restoration, if you will, but that helps sort of cap that off a bit more. I don't know. That's just me speaking out loud here, but the reality is, again, this sort of prioritization and work is similar to all of our other programs, but dissimilar in the fact that this is a program of last resort, unlike some of our other ones.
And while you were talking, it reminded me of one thing that I had promised to clarify. When we're talking about mitigation in that first, we're not talking about interim mitigation. We're talking about mitigating the health risk, not putting a interim solution in that when the money runs out, then we're back to where we started. So the term sometimes are hard to define. They mean different things in different contexts, but what we were trying to convey there is this would be addressing the pathway of risk.
Appreciate that. Thank you. Board Member McGuire.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the presentation. Thank you for the additional commentary. Always helpful, and really, I think a good way to been what I know is a really challenging decision here. And it's right to take the time to think through these different factors and what they actually mean and the significance of it. And so I agree largely with you, Chair Esquivel, and I know there's a lot here. We're not going to dig into all these different factors today. But what I am thinking about is, how can we ensure the maximum benefit with the limited dollars that we have? And one of those areas of we're talking about public human health protection. We're talking about benefiting disadvantaged communities. One of those factors or elements I don't really see here is the population benefit, right? The scale of the project. So we're talking about cost caps. You know, where do we set maybe a ceiling or a goal on cleanup level? I think it matters. You know, what is the scale of these projects? Where are they? Where, you know, how many folks would it benefit? And it's a struggle. I noted the bullet on scoring for projects that don't have data. And I think that's a relevant comment, actually, because there's probably there's thousands of projects out there we don't even know, you know, how significant they are, what those impacts are, and they don't have data. And so we are constrained here with a limited amount of information, and it is possible that some of these projects will have a bit of a leg up because they're a little bit farther down the path in terms of identifying what the impacts have been. Now, maybe that's still the right decision because we have very limited funds, and we should use good information and good data to make informed decisions about where those funds are invested. So that just may be the situation that we're in. And so the other element, I think, we're struggling with is, or at least I am, is one question is, how do we allocate the funds and resources that we have that are limited? That's, I think, the options that you laid out, Mr. Bishop. The other is, how should we be adding projects to the list? And I'll even ask the question, should we be adding projects to the list? Because what I saw today was 144 projects on the fundable list, and I think 279 on the, or roughly on the comprehensive list. And if my, the dollars per project, if I'm doing all my math, that we could easily use the funds available on just those projects alone. So it's just a question. Something I want to think about more, whether we're sending mixed signals to folks or unrealistic expectations by adding more and more projects to a program that's already kind of at its maximum. So I'll just leave that thought out there. And
so can I add for you a little thing to keep in mind there is that mostly when projects come on are dominated, there's some indication of contamination, but not the extent of that contamination. And that first phase is where we determine the extent and how much remediation is needed. So I take it to heart what you said. We should be looking at how many sites we have in that 75% that are in the investigative mode, and looking at how many, if any, we need to add to that, assuming some sort of percentage are going to need to go to cleanup, and assuming some are going to end in that process. On the other hand, what we don't want to do is be in 2030 and have $100 million left over because we limited our initial investigation. So there's a balance there that we need to be striking. And I don't know what it is. And I don't think we'll ever get it exactly right, but thinking about it is an important factor, and I appreciate that.
And I appreciate the points, board member. And, in thinking through one, I agree. It's hard right now, and we already see it. There's a lot of expectation from folks already in the program of like a guarantee of funding a bit, even though we try to be cautious about being clear about where we are, how much resource we actually have, and what that means in our inability to guarantee. And so kind of wanting to then close that universe so that we don't keep over-promising, basically keep bringing people in the door and just kind of leaving them regrettably not able to address their issue. But I think what it does is it butts up against some of our data issues, to your point, where we actually want people to be coming forward so that we know at least what's out there. And I think that that's a fundamental tension here, is trying to cap off expectations. But we do want to know, because that's what will, hopefully, I don't know, what I hope is continue to just highlight them, the continued need, even if we don't have the funding yet. But
yeah, I'm sorry.
Please, Joe.
Feeding off of kind of what you all were talking about, there are a couple points I think we brought out last time, but not this time, that makes this really challenging in terms of when people are, quote unquote, kind of invited to apply. They're actually coming out of the woodwork sometimes, and then being subject to a directive or order that doesn't go away, right? So they may not have been sort of, officially identified as a responsible party or under an enforcement order, and then they need to go through that initial step that we talked about, right, to qualify for funding. And then they come to us, that, I think that's a lot of what we heard last time too, right? Well, we went through this and we thought we were going to get funding, and now I'm sort of left without funding, and still now very obviously almost like, target on your back kind of thing for enforcement. So the other thing to keep in mind in terms of when we're thinking about the fundable list, and totally agree, there's probably a different way we could manage that in terms of, having fewer on the fundable list. But part of our process is at the time that new project is on the fundable list, we may not have thoroughly vetted who the responsible parties are, and certainly have not evaluated their ability to pay. So there are some of those entities that will drop off as we go through that process.
Thank you, Mr. Karkowski. Board Member Firestone.
I'll just, great conversation, lots more to discuss, really tough issues. I think at the core, we need way more money than what we have. I just want to underscore the importance of what we've done this year and the direction that we're going around prioritizing racial equity and bringing that Callan virus screen score and disadvantaged community status like very intentionally into it. I think, we've got orders of magnitude more need than money, and we're never going to get it perfect. And probably all of those are important projects. So I think it also though is about how are we investing the state resources. And I think if we're trying to address racial inequities in the state, as we move forward, we need to be really intentional about it. And I really appreciate that we're doing that here. And I guess also just recognizing we're never going to get, we can drill into all these factors and scores and we're never going to get it perfect. And it takes a lot of work on everyone's time to do that. But we're not even close to funding even a tiny percentage of the need. So I think just thinking about how are we balancing where our impact is and where sort of our efforts are going is important. But I just really value this program. I really do think it's, and I appreciate the context here of not just the sub account, but just the broader cleanup program in general, because this is one piece of it. But it's important to see more broadly, our enforcement work is bringing funding by making responsible parties pay for cleanup. And that's the majority of funding and work that's going into it. So it's, I think it's an important context. I really appreciate it. And thanks for everyone's work.
Completely agree. Thank you, board member. Let's get to some comments. Unless Vice Chair, I think you're good. Okay. Let's go to George Mead, who'll be followed by Jacob Madden.
Hi, good morning. My name's George Mead, and I'm a senior geologist with Trinity Source Group, and I'm speaking on behalf of Trinity today. We have several sites that are in the SCAP grant program and several sites we're working on to get them accepted to become part of the program. We have letters from SCAP staff dated August 31st of 23 that indicate 3 of our existing SCAP grant clients are on the fundable list. However, these letters also state there's no commitment to provide funding because a grantee is on the fundable list. We've acted in good faith with our clients, communicating with SCAP, submitting required documents in accordance with SCAP guidelines, with the understanding that these sites would receive additional SCAP grant funding. However, we have recently been made aware that SCAP will not and has never intended to fund these existing critical juncture grant sites in the SCAP grant program that have been added to the fundable list. Although we've made it onto the fundable list, no money will ever be forthcoming now or in the future for these sites, and it was never the intention of SCAP management to fund these sites. The question we have now is why should any more effort be spent on obtaining additional SCAP grant funding for these existing grant sites at considerable time and expense to our clients, if this situation is in fact true? This is a waste of the state's SCAP staff time, energy, and money. Our question is this the outcome the board wanted and expected for all the months of hard work, the numerous letters written to you from a concerned public, letters written from elected government officials, and after conducting several stakeholder meetings? We need help and clear direction regarding sites in the SCAP program. We're all a team here, the board, SCAP, regulatory agencies, the RPs, consultants, and citizens, and we need to work together as a team. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mead. I'm sure you were privy to some of our discussion here then, and I appreciate, one, the work that you've done and your clients here at the program. But, again, being on the fundable list, as you've heard, we're being cautious here because of the orders of magnitude, as Board Member Firestone said, of difference we have in actual dollars to then the full, commitment of cleanup of any of the sites that are before us. And so hopefully folks are kind of hearing that this isn't, the board here pulling the rug out from folks or having guaranteed something that we're not. It's actually creating priority in this program. And importantly, really here having an honest discussion with the fact that the amounts that we have don't add up to the 12 billion in total that are all of current applications that are before us. So appreciate it. The fundable list is here to help us narrow in on those projects that can be funded. But the reality is, even as we've discussed here, the number that are on that fundable list, we don't have the dollars sitting around to be able to fully commit. And we're trying to create a fair process here amongst not just your applications, but many of the others that I'm sure here we'll hear from other folks as well. So appreciate the feedback and look forward to the further engagement in helping us understand how we equitably commit to what is, too far a huge, need that we're unable to completely meet. So appreciate that, Mr. Mead. Next, I'd like to call up Jacob Madden, will be followed by Edward Firestone, Esquire.
Thank you, board members. So I'm Jacob Madden with PG and program manager for the San Mateo County Groundwater Protection Program. My comments are specifically kind of regarding the stakeholder meetings. It should be noted that the process for selecting and engaging stakeholders has not been transparent. It's my understanding that local agencies were specifically excluded from these initial meetings and the whole process to date. I understand the need to create an equitable priority system to distribute limited resources for the greatest impact. However, excluding the very people with the breadth and depth of technical expertise and tasked with representing our local communities and protecting health and prioritizing risk on a daily basis does not make logical sense. I urge the board to require greater transparency in the stakeholder selection process and engagement of all stakeholders that are impacted by the funding priority methodology. And with regard to the current ranking methodology, I know you guys aren't voting on anything today. I've previously submitted a letter dated May 16th regarding my concerns with that methodology. But again, that methodology was apparently enacted without any kind of outside technical peer review and without adequate public notice, as far as I'm aware. I would urge you guys to consider significant changes to that, the methodology, primarily that it be risk driven. And I think you guys were talking about, what should your funding priorities be and how do you use the money to the greatest extent? And I think, when you have a site with complete exposure pathways, that should really be your cleanup goal, is to basically eliminate the exposure pathway that's complete. I think that's a pretty simple way to kind of approach a lot of these sites going forward. One of the other points I wanted to point out is, the risk score is calculated, needs to be able to allow weighing the number of affected receptors. So right now it doesn't do that. It doesn't consider commercial versus residential receptors. It doesn't recognize the severity of a single compound release or a single exposure pathway. I think you guys already touched upon like the vapor intrusion as a pathway, which, currently the ranking doesn't really give extra weight to. And honestly, that is the biggest pathway that we encounter, and should be ranked as such. That's pretty much all I had to add today, but thank you so much for listening, and I hope you guys take action soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Madden. I appreciate your contributions to this and noted on the frustration around some of the transparency on the stakeholder groups. I'll want to be following up with that, so I appreciate that. Next, I'd like to call up Edward Firestone, Esquire, who will be followed by William Yu and Thomas Boyes.
Thank you, Chairman Esquivel and members of the board. Appreciate the opportunity to speak. I spoke the last time we all got together to discuss this program. And my comments, I'd like to second what Mr. Mead and what Mr. Madden said. Some of my comments are going to relate to what they said, but I have my own particular perspective on this based on the work that was done to move 3 of my sites, which are all in San Mateo County, from the non-fundable, well, they had been funded, but to make sure they remained on the fundable list. There were 3 of the 25 legacy sites. And it was our understanding this would get us back into the fundable list, which would make us, we all understand that no guarantees. That was in the very beginning letters when we entered the program. But we need to at least get on the fundable list. We spent a lot of time, both with regional board members, state board members, consultants. 2 of the sites are in Assemblywoman Pappen's region. We brought her office in to take a look at this, and she supported moving the 2 sites in her district back onto the fundable list. And so we were successful in being 3 of the 25, I guess that makes us 3 of the 14, whatever, that actually moved. And I have other sites that didn't make it. My problem I got now is that, as Mr. Mead said, we've been led that there's an understanding that, yeah, just because you're now back onto the fundable list, the weighting system that we're going to be using, and by the way, I personally and my clients completely support efforts for environmental justice and equity. But we spent a lot of resources to get back onto the list, but if we're never going to be funded, which is what our understanding is of the current circumstance, it doesn't make any sense. So we wasted a lot of effort, a lot of money, a lot of time. Assemblywoman Patton's office was involved. And if it doesn't matter, we shouldn't have gone through the exercise to begin with. I think that's what most frustrates us. So I want to make sure that was clear for everyone, that we can't set up processes that don't have meaning. If you're going to have a process, have it be useful, have it meaningful, have people listen, and don't have what we perceive to be a preconditioned approach to the program. I want to thank you for the time. Appreciate the efforts that have been made, especially by state water board staff and regional water board staff, and also by county staff that I've worked with. So I want to thank you for that time. Appreciate it.
I appreciate that, Mr. Farson. To be clear, if a project is on the fundable list, it is eligible for funding. And again, still subject to whatever actual amounts we have amongst those. And as we noted, it's not true to say that your project getting on the fundable list is actually not fundable and you're being told that you won't be funded. Today's conversation has been, I hope, cogently articulating here that the number even of projects on the fundable list still yet dwarfs the actual amount that we have. So by that very nature is what you're hearing around cautiousness on guaranteeing funding further. But I appreciate your frustrations that we're clearly hearing from you and Mr. Mead. Mr. Karkowski, is there anything you'd further like to say?
Yeah, thanks, Chair Esquivel. I'm not sure where that communication came from. It's nonsensical. I mean, we're not going to put people on a fundable list and say that therefore disqualifies you from funding. So the process, though, as you were alluding to, is when folks are on the fundable list, and as we gather that information, which can take a lot of time and energy and effort, acknowledge that that's true of many of our funding programs, we vet that information, right? The technical team, together with the regional board or the local regulatory agency, review that. And, and in the cases that Mr. Firestone was pointing out, they'll look at what has been done already, what improvements have we seen, what's being asked for in terms of additional scope. As we discussed, we're looking at that cost and environmental benefit factor, right? That's a statutory factor that we need to consider. And then eventually we'll get to meet with the delegated authority to make a decision in terms of whether or not to fund that at the requested amount or potentially at another amount, sort of per board policy. But we're going through all of those, new projects, legacy projects, ones that were legacy and on the fundable list, others that weren't and have been moved to the fundable list. So we're going through that whole process. And to your earlier point, while we're doing that, we're looking at what our overall portfolio, the amount of funding that we have available. So just want to assure the folks who've obviously heard something different, that if they did get a decision to be on the fundable list, that as we get that information for consideration of requests for additional funding, we're reviewing that as we would any other project.
Thank you, Mr. Karkowski. And thank you, Mr. Firestone. Next, I'd like to go to William Yu, who will be followed by Thomas Boyes.
Yes, good morning, Chair Esquivel and board members. First, I want to thank you all for the opportunity for holding this forum today and giving me and the other members to speak. I also want to acknowledge Mr. Karkowski and his team, especially because I've been able to participate in several of the stakeholder meetings, and Ms. Prowl was instrumental to ensure that all voices were heard. So I do appreciate that opportunity. And I'm essentially here today to just give some additional visibility on some of the issues that were brought to light today. First, my name is William Yu, and I'm the designated contact for SCAP grantees John Ji Young Yu and Nancy Namwa Yu, who are also my parents. They have been the grantees for SCAP grant SC066, which is also for Go and Go Cleaners. And if anything, their situation reflects some RPs who are legacy, who are RPs who were on the fundable list, and they now were recently deemed to not be merited to be on the list. So they were admitted in 2000. In May of this year, of course, they were notified that they were not added to the fundable list. An appeal was submitted per the processes that were in place. However, that was denied in August, and they were advised in that same letter that the project would be reassessed for fiscal year 24-25. So that's a sit in the backdrop. Essentially, the Golden Globe project didn't make the fundable list because some of the scoring metrics were very heavily weighted in certain areas that really just put the Golden Globe project and barred it from the fundable list. And unfortunately, it had a disproportionate impact on grantees, such as my parents in this situation here. In addition, their project reflects the case that was identified earlier, where data was not fully available. That could have enhanced the score in the human health risk assessment area, but the data was not available at the time. Although we have been able to obtain data after this process, which changes the position of the project substantially. So essentially, I'm asking today at the board, and after hearing everything they've heard today, if they to respectfully ask the board to reconsider the current scoring criteria and to just consider additional factors that especially involve legacy RPs like my parents. Just briefly, if I may comment on their position, first, they are tremendously grateful to be part and to have been accepted into the SCAP program. It has been literally a godsend over these past couple of years. Everybody has been tremendous. The project manager that we worked with, Jamie Ritchie, Levi Pratt, and everybody has just been wonderful to work with. But of course, we're at this juncture now where they're not funded for FY 23-24. We're going to be, if I may, again, comment on the position. They were, again, specifically asked to be regulated back in 1999. However, again, they're not in the funded position. So now they're in an extremely difficult situation where the additional work will not be funded for fiscal year 23-24. And as I mentioned earlier, some additional work has been done where that would essentially place the project now at a critical juncture, and that project is ready for remedial measures to be implemented. So again, I understand, and I completely understand that nothing is ever guaranteed. Being on the fact that my request is to change the criteria, change that factors that are considered, so at least legacy projects can receive that such additional consideration, however it may be, because as I mentioned before in the stakeholder sessions, it effectively leaves them in a worse situation than before. As you again, apologies if this is various obvious statements, but again, I just wanted to make sure you had some additional visibility from this perspective. So That said, again, as it stands, my parents are elderly, and again, it's an extreme burden for the situation for what they're at now. But again, I just ask that the board consider everything that's been presented, consider my comments, and to just take that all into consideration when in its decision making and voting for the new scoring criteria and whatever else is considered for SCAP funding, especially for the parties that are legacy members that were essentially brought into the program, developed, and then essentially dropped, and then left without any other recourse. So again, I want to really appreciate all of your time, and thank you again. And I appreciate everything that you do for the community as well. Have a good day.
Thank you, Mr. Yu. I appreciate that engagement. No need to be sorry at all. I appreciate the reiteration, even of points here, and thanks for engaging on this. I would ask Mr. Karkowski, when it comes to folks that maybe didn't have enough data developed to in this this tranche of reconsideration be brought in, but in a year or two or other moments or gather that data, are they able essentially to kind of come back with that, even though we're currently outside of that period? I know that we had at least put in to allow for reconsideration for this cycle.
Yeah, and that's what we did during that sort of initial 90-day or so period, allowing for that additional information to be submitted. And part of this is how we're managing our workload. I didn't want us in like a continuous loop of like updating the fundable list. We have that time period now for when we come to next year, where we can update the information we have, and if it changes the score, or again, we may be modifying the methodology depending on your direction and the recommendations we come back with. So yeah, the short answer is yes, there would be that opportunity to add that additional information.
Thank you for that, Mr. Karkowski, and thank you again, Mr. Yu. Next, I'd like to call up Thomas Boyes, who'll be followed by Matthew Earnshaw and Rachel Mellinger, and then we'll wrap up with Wyatt Patak.
Good morning. This is Tom Boy. Can you all hear me?
You can.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you as a board for your hard work, your wisdom, and your compassion in how you're administering the SCAP fund. Thank you to Craig Sanchez and his team from the SCAP Fund for all the care and kindnesses, and your staff attorney, Julie Osborne, for her guidance. You as an organization, you really make a difference in people's lives. I'm here to speak to you today about Robert Ciencio. He's an 82-year-old man, and he has advanced dementia. And your SCAP grants making a difference in his life at a point when his body is failing him, and his wife also is struggling with crippling disabilities. He and his older brother, Henry, who were close and loving siblings, owned a strip mall in Westminster, California, and it was their retirement savings plan. And the strip mall had a dry cleaner using PCE that was operated by an elderly couple that has no resources. In 2018, Robert and Henry discovered PCE contaminated soil and groundwater because of environmental due diligence by a potential buyer. Robert and Henry immediately reported the discovery to the State Department of Toxic Substances Control. Thereafter, they applied for a SCAP grant. And in 2019, they entered into a standard voluntary agreement with the DTSC. In 2020, Robert and Henry submitted and processed financial documentation and also developed a scope of work for comprehensive site assessment, both on-site and off-site, for soil vapor, indoor air, and groundwater contamination. Thank you, because in 2021, they qualified for and were awarded a $1.3 million SCAP grant. And that was for both site assessment and remediation. And it was issued only in the name of Henry Ciancio Trust, not the Robert Ciancio Trust. SCEP funding underwrote an investigation that showed significant on-site soil vapor, and indoor air contamination. Most importantly, the investigation also showed a significant off-site migration of both groundwater and soil vapor. In 2022, unfortunately, Henry Ciancio left us. He died from cancer. And SCEP counsel Julie Osborne advised us that the SCEP grant had to be terminated and reapplied for by the Robert Ciancio Trust, which we did. And in 2022 and 2023, we had to sit out that fiscal year of funding. And Robert submitted a SCEP grant application and was prioritized to a lower ranking off the fundable list. In June of this year, we applied for reconsideration by SCEP, and the Robert Ciancio Trust was re-added to the fundable list, and we're grateful for that. There have been some delays since that. We are one of your legacy projects, and we're at a critical juncture of investigating off-site soil vapor and indoor air impacts. I'm here today to plead for your mercy. I don't do that too much as an attorney, but I'm doing it here today. Not only for the Ciancios, but for their neighbors. Robert and his wife, Dee Dee, want to encourage the State Water Resources Board to resume funding because they care and are concerned about their neighbors. There are 2 adjacent low-income multifamily apartments occupied by folks of color and young children who are sensitive receptors. There's an adjacent elder care facility with 30 beds, people struggling to come back from acute illness and injuries who are also sensitive receptors. As a side issue, this area is also on the tribal land list, and there are many environmental justice implications. We're concerned because there are significant unaddressed human health risk implications for sensitive receptors. The Ciancios are very sensitized. Their closest living relative died from cancer. I know that a little bit myself. My wife's a stage 4 cancer survivor, and I've been there in the cancer wards with her. And I'm sure that many of you have dear loved ones who have fought that battle. You folks are our last resort. We're grateful for whatever you can do for the Ciancios in their final season of life. A lot of people can benefit from what you do for this project and the way that you invest your grant money here. So again, thank you for your time and your past kindnesses. We're grateful.
Thank you, Mr. Bois. I appreciate your engagement around this, your representation of the projects here in the community that is being impacted. Appreciate your words and continued work around this. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Next, I'd like to call up Matthew Earnshaw, who'll be followed by Rachel Mellinger. Okay, I don't believe Mr. Earnshaw is on, and we can move to Rachel Mellinger, who will be followed by Wyatt Patak. Good morning.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
We can, thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Good morning. And first of all, just thank you for taking the time to hear our comments for the work that you're all doing. My name is Rachel Mellinger, and I work at Terminal Engineering and Manufacturing in Berkeley. We believe that SCEP is using the ranking system in a genuine effort to provide funds to those companies with environmental issues and the most need that also pose the highest risk. It is clear that effort is being made to create an equitable system. However, more real-life factors are not always accounted for during the current evaluation. Terminal is a small business, both minority and women-owned. My parents, the owners, purchased this property and this company after the contamination occurred, and thus became the RP. It's also an orphan site. So the terminal and the current owners are not considered the source of PC contamination, but we have been working to work towards site cleanup. We've had to take out very high rate loans because of the environmental factor and spent millions of dollars already on this work so we can comply with the water board directives to complete site cleanup. We are far along in the site cleanup process, but this cost is ongoing and thus is not sustainable. So we are on the fundable list with a score of 25.5, but we do not currently qualify for the disadvantaged community designation. We are in the industrial side of Berkeley. We understand that Berkeley itself would not be considered DAC. However, we are on the industrial side. We literally are right at the train tracks. And if anyone has ever been to our site, they understand that this community overall would comply with disadvantaged community status. If the DAC designation were allocated to our site, it would greatly improve our likelihood of being funded. We have a 0 ranking right now for DAC. If 6 or 12 would be huge. The current methodology does not capture other real-life factors, and that's what we're seeing. Businesses like Terminal, small family businesses who did not cause the contamination, have tried to clean up their sites in any way possible, should not be overlooked, and will potentially be unable to perform needed work or go into so much debt to address the work that the business is put into a very tough financial situation. How can more real life and other factors be taken into account moving forward?
Thank you, Ms. Mellinger. I appreciate those comments, and I know here we'll continue to have discussion around the formula and getting that right balance. And if there are more localized data for your project, please do help bring that forward. And thank you for your engagement around this. Next, I'd like to call up Wyatt Patak.
Good morning. My name is Wyatt Patak, and I represent Central Assembly of Richmond. I have two things to bring up. On June 19th, 2023, on behalf of our board, I wrote a letter to Chair Swivel and also Deputy Director Karkowski, asking them to reconsider approving our grant application for SCAP. I have not heard back from either one of them on the application. I have been privileged to join some of the meetings with the stakeholder meetings, and I do appreciate that. But I did not receive a response to that letter asking for us to be reconsidered, since we were previously a 10 out of 10 on health and safety prior to the changes of the spring meeting. Second thing I would like to bring up is I think since we're talking about billions of dollars being needed to fund more more approved sites, and also ones that haven't been approved yet, such as Central Assembly of Richmond, I would definitely strongly recommend that perhaps we as a group maybe can try to get a meeting with our state legislators and our California governor as well, to talk to them about this severe lack in finances for the program. We need billions of dollars to be in SCAP, and right now we only have millions. I think it was, and correct me if I'm wrong after I speak, I think it was around 26 million or something offered. And as you guys had said previously, the average applicant probably needs close to maybe up as much as $8 million in funding. And we have hundreds, if not thousands, of sites that need to be funded as soon as possible. So I would urge the State Water Resources Board and the Deputy Karkowski to definitely consider even maybe an urgent meeting with the state legislators and explain to them that, you know, state of California has a budget surplus, and maybe we can use some of that budget surplus to get into the SCAP program where it's heavily needed. The other point I would bring up with the California legislators is right now we have a huge amount of people leaving the state. And if we are not able to fund these sites adequately, then they might leave the state, and there may be less money in the future for all departments of the state of California, including the California State Water Board. So, and of course, since I'm suggesting the idea, I would be glad to help in any way possible if you guys thought that was appropriate. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Patak. I appreciate your engagement and your suggestions here. And on the letter issue, we'll make sure and track it down and make sure you're given a response. Apologize rather, if we weren't able to get that response here yet to you. So just thank you. I appreciate that engagement and the suggestions. Okay, I think that wraps up our commenters for this item. It's a non-voting item. This is an informational item, and appreciate the circle back. I know there's a lot of discussion here. We know a lot of need, and appreciate elevating and coming back to folks to help understand where we are. But look to my fellow board colleagues for additional comment. Board Member McGuire.
Yes, thank you. I guess I just wanted to maybe follow up and circle back to the comment from San Mateo, from Jacob Madden about the stakeholder group configuration or composition. Can you clarify just how that was developed and who's, he asserted that there's no local agencies involved in the stakeholder group. So can you just kind of let me know where we're at now and what you're thinking about for the future?
Sure. I'll speak to that since Marina Perez in our Office of Public Participation and I facilitated the stakeholder outreach. And we tried to keep the participation in that stakeholder group somewhat small so that everyone could have a chance to speak and that a variety of perspectives were able to come forth. And so we invited some of the existing legacy sites applicants to come. We also invited people from a range of perspectives to come. We did not invite the counties. And in part, that was because we thought that other processes would be there to get their input. We have regular meetings through the site cleanup program with our county colleagues. We have quarterly roundtables. And so we've been briefing them about this process through those roundtables, but didn't have the formal feedback mechanism. So it is something that I hope we can do more of and do better as we move forward to really hear their input and have that considered in the process.
Yeah,
thank you for that clarification. I appreciate that commitment. There's a lot of moving parts here and a lot of policy considerations, and it sounds like the counties have been very engaged with a number of these projects and have a lot to say. And so thank you for incorporating their voices into this.
Yeah, and that does remind me, one of the parts of the resolution was for us to talk about the potential for a stakeholder advisory group. Our preference would be to keep it informal as we have it. Once we establish a stakeholder advisory group, like we have, say, with the SAFER program, it becomes very formalized and a pretty big level of effort. But we can certainly be more transparent about, who is part of that group. And as Cheryl was saying, to the extent we're not connecting with certain folks, we can be more intentional about that engagement.
Yeah, and it sounds like we have a deeper, more intentional engagement with counties, it seems, already in another space. But, readouts maybe from that smaller group, or even just allowing a county rep to be there may be helpful as well. Appreciate, though, this, the intentionality, again, of even just creating the groups and really trying to ensure we get the best out of folks in their engagement. So thank you. Vice Chair.
Well, I just want to thank everyone for the really good discussion here today, and just chiming in here on going forward and seeking out additional thoughts from community members. And it seems to me that there's, two separate groups. There's those that are in, either in process, on the list, want to be on the list, very specific focus on individual projects. And then there's the larger policy considerations that we've been talking about. And I just think that pulling together, whether it's a staff workshop or, sort of reaching out to others that may not have necessarily been engaged, other stakeholder groups, like the environmental justice groups, to seek out their thoughts on these policy considerations. And then also thinking, connecting with Cal EPA on that issue as well, looking at there's the disadvantaged communities list as a result of, I can't remember what it is, I can't remember the bill number, but then there's also Cal EnviroScreen. And there's just a lot of ways of, trying to get to the bottom of how communities are impacted. And I appreciate the comments that you made, Board Member McGuire, about exposure, population exposure. And I think, Cal EPA can probably assist with that. And I'm recalling that where we had a much larger funding formulas to address at ARB, we were focused with a lot of these challenges as well, and kind of looking for hybrid considerations where you're considering impact, but also population exposure, and not going too far on one extreme or the other. Because if you do, then you end up, there are certain areas of the state that wouldn't have the benefit. And it just seems like it would be out of balance. So I think there are other processes that are out there that we might want to take a look at. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Vice Chair. I completely agree.
Yeah, and I'll just say I know I had expressed wanting to make sure that we're hearing from a lot of those voices, and staff had really, both the staff, including Marina, OPP, and others have really, I think, done a great job of being really intentional about diversifying the categories that we're hearing from. So we're not only hearing from folks that were already enrolled. And that's a really important perspective. I think we need to do a lot to engage, but it seems like there's a lot of voices that aren't otherwise engaged. And so making sure that we're being really intentional about that. Our staff has done that, and I really appreciate those efforts. I think that's critical to helping us develop a pathway forward, and look forward to that continuing.
If I didn't explicitly say it, EJ groups were one of the groups that we really tried to reach out to as we formulated that stakeholder group to make sure that those voices got brought forward. So we'd had decent representation from those groups.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Board Member. I think that concludes this item. Just incredible thanks to everyone for this work, and looking forward to what I know is going to be further here discussion, and appreciate everyone's continued highlight of the need and the criticality of the work. So thank you, Mr. Karkowski. That wraps up item. Well, it wraps up this item and brings us to, I think, our last. I think it's item number 10 here, which is presentation of our fiscal year 2022-23 annual performance report. Let's go ahead and take 5 minutes as we transition the panel. And so let's come back here at 11:45. Thanks, everyone. All right, we're at 11:45 and we can come back and complete our last item, which is our yearly performance report. And at the top, just as always, incredible thanks to what I'm very fortunate for, which is a culture here of transparency and information and data-driven policy work. And this performance report, now, how many years would this now be? 15 years of work. Demonstrates it, and year after year, just really appreciate the improvements that have been done here. So without further ado, kick it over to Greg and Bev.
And hi, good afternoon-ish, almost. Board Member Esquivel and Board Member McGuire and anyone else who's traveling and still channeling their thoughts. Thank you for having us. We'll be brief. I'm going to hand it quickly over to Bev. My name is Greg Gerhardt, though I'm Deputy Director for Information Management Analysis. And I've been here those whole 15 years.
Good morning, Chair Esquivel and Board Member McGuire. It seems we've lost others, so I'll focus on you. My name is Bev Anderson. I'm the lead for the performance reports for the Water Resources Control Board, and I work in the Office of Information Management Analysis. We're going to be presenting the summary of the fiscal year 2022-2023 performance report today. So next slide, please. As was just pointed out, this past year was the 15th year of the performance report, which draws on data from many databases used by the programs of the water boards. Several years ago, we spent substantial time migrating the performance reports into interactive dashboards. The last couple of years have been focused on improving the data connections, working with programs to update targets and measures, and adding new programs and ones that we didn't have measures or targets previously for. We've also added location maps to a lot of the cards where we have good geospatial data because everyone loves a map. And we're exploring new ways of displaying the data and getting more comprehensive stories out of our cards. We continue to work on developing outcome-based measures to add to the water quality report cards and the non-point source success stories, while we're also trying to figure out how to use and improve racial equity and disadvantaged community data within the cards. Next slide, please. These performance reports have been a web-based summary of work done by the Water Board, organized by major functions such as enforcement, regulation, and planning and assessment. They help document our efforts to protect and allocate the waters of California. The reports have been used to help us learn from successes and challenges in major mission areas and to systematically manage and evaluate programs, activities, and priorities, and to improve efficiencies of the programs while we've been improving the efficiency of our own reporting. They're being actively used by program staff at almost all of the regions now to make sure data have been input correctly and to track work being done during the year. Next slide. And now I want to go into some of the numbers and some of the parts of the report itself. As you know, the Water Board is large with offices throughout the state and staff all over the place. Staff are charged with regulating approximately 60,000 discharger facilities, a number that increases every year, and that'll come up in a later slide, and determining water allocations for about 35,000 water right holders, as well as monitoring and tracking water quality, enforcing regulations, and funding various programs. This slide gives a snapshot in time of some of the things that are being done, but many of our dashboards allow for looking at trends over time or for digging into the data behind these numbers. So it allows for a lot of playing around with the data that are out there available. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, the report is not super easy to find. If you've forgotten how to get to it, you have to scroll way down to the bottom of any page of the website. And there under the resources column, it's down near the bottom with the performance report. And that link will take you to the most recent year of the performance reports. Next slide, please. And from there, you can access previous years. Most of the dashboards now contain all of the previous years of data. We still have a few that we're working out some slight glitches with how data are being pulled. So we haven't been able to get that on every dashboard. And that's one thing we are working for. Many of those previous years, some of the software to build the charts no longer is supported. So we'd like to get those archived and just focus on the dashboards that are posted now. Next slide, please. I'm going to provide a summary of some of the major targets and measures tracked by the performance report. This slide summarizes some of our inspections and how things have been going over the last several years. Inspections are a primary tool used to determine and document compliance of the facilities we regulate. In spite of staffing issues at some regions and unexpectedly high snow levels in some areas last winter, overall inspection numbers have actually been increasing since the pandemic shutdowns. Not up to pre-pandemic levels yet, but they are coming up and getting more efficient. The regions are getting better at getting out. And I know plans have been made for those areas where they tend to get snow to get a lot of their inspections done earlier before the snows hit, so they don't get stuck like they did last winter. Several of our programs have US EPA commitments to inspect facilities on a certain schedule. NPDES major facilities are required to be inspected every 2 years, while minor facilities are every 5 years. This loosely converts to inspecting 50% of majors each year and 20% of the minors each year. And we're seeing that our regions are very close. They hit 49% of facilities, major facilities, and 25% of minor facilities inspected. As I said, the percents are loosely related to actually hitting the facilities on those years, but we've been working with the US EPA and the NPDES program to make sure that our inspections are being done at those facilities that require them, and it's meeting those commitments and not just a random 50% or 20%. So a lot of work has been going into that to align our targets with the US EPA commitments. And then these numbers roll up into some of our targets, and I'll go over the main part of the targets now in the next couple of slides. Next slide, please. At the beginning of each fiscal year, the state and regional boards, divisions, and offices establish targets for the workload to be achieved. Then at the end of the fiscal year, we determine the actual work completed and compare it to the targets to assess the programs. This graph shows some of those statewide targets rolled up into 3 categories: inspections, permitting, and other program targets, which includes things like the adoption of TMDLs and basin plan amendments, cleanup activities, funding, and a few other areas. Generally, inspection targets are more often met than other targets because they tend to be short-term projects that are much easier to schedule and complete than, say, a TMDL adoption, which could be delayed for any number of reasons and targets be missed that way. Next slide, please. And then looking at the regions or the various organizations, this summarizes the targets achieved for the last couple of years. And as I mentioned earlier, many of the regions are now using the targets to track their work, and you can see the targets being reached are increasing. And if I were to add some more years to that, you would see a definite increase in the targets. And this is in spite of us getting those US EPA commitments matched to the targets. So they're meeting slightly higher targets than they have in some cases in the past. You can see that the targets, meeting the targets varies substantially through the different regions, and this often reflects, the priorities, the things that are going on in the regions at the time, staffing issues, things like that. So we don't put this up to compare the regions to each other, just to show that they are out there and meeting their targets to the best extent they can. Next slide, please. Excuse me. The last two slides showed how well we set and achieved our workload goals, but they don't really give a picture in terms of the total volume of work, which would be really hard to do in a single slide. This table shows some of the big picture numbers of the facilities and associated regulatory work, including some water rights and drinking water program details. While the number of regulated facilities continues to grow through the state, as you can see, our numbers have gone up 2,000 in regulated facilities over the last 3 years. It appears that our individual permits being issued or updated is going down substantially. And part of this, when we start looking at the numbers, is many of the regions are moving minor individual permits into general permits in order to streamline the process and help get more consistency through the permits that they're working on. So this is another area that we're working with the programs to determine how to capture those things that are going on in the data. So we've got a big push to try to figure that one out for this next few months. Next slide, please. And here's a link when you have access to this that will take you directly to the 22-23 performance report. And with that, I'd like to go into some of the dashboards and share some of the stories that we can get out of the data that we've got that are being collected for the performance report. So next slide, please. One of our programs, the non-point source program, tracks outcome-based measures similar to the TMDL, Total Maximum Daily Load program. The State Water Board receives grant funding from US EPA under Section 319 of the Clean Water Act to fund projects that reduce non-point source pollution. Examples of these projects might include things like installation of fencing and off-stream watering, in order to manage livestock grazing, forest road improvements to reduce sediment loads, or stream restoration to address historic hydromodification. These non-point source success stories are fairly comprehensive stories that the program works with the US EPA to finalize and get posted. So they've done a very nice job of writing these stories. Next slide, please. And again, as I mentioned, they're similar to our water quality report cards, but they tend to go much more into the story than the water quality report cards, and cover a lot more detail. So there's a lot of work that goes behind these, and they're showing some very nice successes. And this is another program that I'm working on to figure out some more measures and possible targets that we can set for non-point source. Next slide, please. You heard a lot from the Division of Financial Assistance this morning, so a couple of slides for that program. The dashboard for DFA includes a map of projects funded during the fiscal year. DFA gets about 75% of disbursements processed in less than 60 days, and they have a goal of getting those to disadvantaged communities processed in less than 30 days. And they've done quite a good job at doing this, as you heard earlier. They also have a commitment to execute applications for all of their rollover projects by the end of this fiscal year. Next, please. And if we look at these projects, this focuses on the Disadvantaged Communities Project. Out of almost 300 projects that were funded this last fiscal year, 136 of them were in disadvantaged communities, amounting to close to 40% of the funding that went out. So they do have a focus on getting that out. Next slide, please.
Glad to see meeting our Justice 40 goals unto ourselves here.
And then another one for financial assistance, just a bit more about their data. They distributed nearly $1.2 billion this past fiscal year, with over $200 million to clean water projects that we're developing new supplies through water recycling, stormwater capture, and groundwater recharge as described in Governor Newsom's water supply strategy. So a lot of information behind this, and you can actually see the actual projects. And one thing that's missed on that, a question came up this morning about knowing how many people are affected by these projects, and that's actually in this dashboard that gets missed on the edge of that table. So we do have those data available. Next slide, please. The fees dashboard has been sadly behind the times for the last several years, and we were able to work with the fees program this year and get things updated. So they were having some struggles with database changes, and we've got them almost up to date. I'm just waiting for the 22-23 data, but we've got everything from 17-18, which was where we got stuck, up to 21-22 at this point, and worked with them to reconfigure the card to make it a little more user-friendly and figure out what it's showing. So they are using these at their stakeholder meetings for showing how the fees are being broken down.
That's where my mind was going. So thank you for that. That's great.
Yeah. Next slide, please. And then every year I have to give a shout out to the total maximum daily load program, partly because this is where most of my time ends up. It's a bit of a time sink working with everything that they do. So a little bit about this, they write quite a few report cards every year. And at this point, we have 276 water quality report cards posted on the website, documenting the assessments for 233 separate projects. There are a number of projects that regions will reassess and write updated report cards for, so slightly fewer projects than actual report cards. Cards illustrating projects with improving conditions or meeting targets are slightly more numerous than those showing data inconclusive or what's the other category? Improvement needed, sorry. One thing we don't specifically see looking at the TMDL report cards is the number of delistings from the US EPA 303D list of impaired water bodies. We do have that on one of the parts of the dashboard. And what we've seen, that is now sort of being handled by the integrated report on a biannual basis. But looking at those data as of the 2020 to 2022 assessment, there have been about 2,500 non-administrative delistings from 200 water body segments since, I believe it was the 2016 integrated report. And that's by non-administrative, those delistings are indicating actual improvements being seen with the listing that's there. So we're actually seeing some good things happening in many areas through the state.
That's great to hear. And I know as our processing power on the integrated report and all those lines of evidence get better, and as we get more closer to having more real-time understanding, I think that's great. And I'm glad to see those improvements.
One other thing that I'd like to point out about these water quality report cards, right now for most regions, it means pulling data from various areas and building a report card from scratch, figuring out what the data show. Region 3 this past year had a pilot project to automate the building of the skeleton report card. So they are now set up that they can continuously assess all of their listings and put out report cards as needed. And we're looking at trying to expand that to other regions that are interested, and hopefully all of them. So we aren't looking at like a 6-month process to get to a card. So that's a really exciting thing to get out there.
Hugely exciting. I appreciate that.
Next slide, please. When we look a little more closely into the data of the TMDL dashboard, we can see a few patterns starting to emerge. The report cards assessing pesticides tend to show the most improvement that we're seeing, with 23 projects showing improvement or improved conditions or targets met. And this is often associated with time after the banning of certain pesticides. So we are seeing some improvements there. Nutrients and bacteria tend to be assessed and reassessed the most often. And nutrients are similarly showing some improvements, with 19 of those projects showing some improvements. And then report cards assessing point source pollutants tend to show slightly better success than non-point source. And the non-point source ones, we're seeing a little bit more focus in the non-point source program, but we do have some cards for sediment pollutants, and they're showing a little less improvement because there are a number of different places where the sediment is coming from, and it's difficult to figure out, what all the non-point source things are. That was a bad choice of word. I'm sorry.
I once said it is what it is at the dais, and I still regret it. So.
Next slide, please. And then this is just a blow up of one of the report cards. This one's showing trash, which is a relatively new pollutant being addressed by several of the regions. And generally, these aren't seeing a lot of direct improvement yet. They are pretty new in most places to have the trash TMDLs. This was kind of a nice card, and that's why I chose to highlight this here. They are actually seeing conditions improving. They've been getting better compliance with the MS4 catch basins, with putting in the full trash capture. So they're seeing throughout the Santa Monica Bay watershed, they're seeing better conditions as far as the trash. So again, another exciting thing to have going on. Next slide, please. And then this is the last dashboard that I wanted to take a look at. Usually I try to highlight dashboards that are showing things improving. In this case, we're seeing reductions over the year in what's happening. This is the Surface Water and Ambient Monitoring Program, or SWAMP. SWAMP was created to coordinate water quality monitoring conducted by the state and regional boards to assess the attainment of all the core beneficial uses in all water body types. The SWAMP annual budget has pretty much remained stagnant for the last 10 years. Operating costs have continued to increase. As well as seeing the laboratory and cost increase, SWAMP has had to redirect resources to address monitoring needs in relation to drought, wildfire, flooding, and emerging contaminants. Several years ago, when I was with the harmful algal bloom program, the initial funding that we were able to use was cannibalized from the SWAMP program. So they are losing the ability to do some of the things that they are set to be doing. So in general, the number of site visits and the number of analyses of various types have decreased over time. We had a significant drop off, obviously, with the COVID shutdowns. Not only were prices increasing, but they simply couldn't go out and do the collecting. And now with changes to labs and the contracts increasing, it's more and more difficult to do the analyses that are needed in order to protect human health and environment.
Yeah, given all the challenges, that trend should be going in the opposite direction. And I appreciate this flag because I'm going to be making it a point then to focus more on the program this next year and really figure out how we can help, to your point, get more resources to it.
We appreciate that. Thank you. And one final slide, just as a quick summary of some of the things that we've been doing. Again, some of our recent enhancements include the aligning the core program targets with the US EPA commitments and working with the programs to make sure they're meeting those US EPA commitments, continuing to improve those data connections, and working with programs to add new measures and ways of displaying data. We're actively working at adding racial equity issues and environmental justice to as many of the cards as we can. And we're continuing to improve the reports and are excited to see the direction that we can go. with some of these, where some of the areas that we're looking at filling gaps in are the CAA program. Currently, it's hard to get Cleanup and Abatement Act data to show, so we're working to get a card associated with that. Cannabis is still lagging for us, so we'd like to actively work with them to get some targets if that's possible for cannabis. And then drinking water, although they do have a dashboard, it's not an awful lot in there, and we're in constant communication with the drinking water program to add some targets, add some more measures for that, and many other things. So, and with that, next slide. Did someone have a question? Did I talk over? Next slide, I will turn over to Mr. Gearhart.
Thanks, Beth. Great work as usual. I wanted to provide some larger picture window on the things that are happening around the space. We've had the same performance report card as was mentioned for 15 years, but over time, we've also been doing additional things, some by choice and some by being voluntold, that are similar in regards to measuring effectiveness or efficiency or outcomes of programs. And so I wanted to just bring this to like the larger view. So for example, in the last couple of years, we've been working on projects that use the acronym OKR. Joaquin, you don't have to make the OKR, but I'll do it for you. Objectives and key results is a nationwide effort to again, sort of set your objectives on a relatively short time frame. So as opposed to maybe our annual report and our multi-year approach to trying to affect change, OKRs tend to be used on a shorter time frame. So we have a couple of pilots working with the governor's office on OKRs. And one is a pilot with the site cleanup program, which has embraced this wholeheartedly and done a really good job of thinking about how to use this as a way to align and sort of synergize the other efforts that they're doing in the site cleanup program. So you may be hearing more about that. The other sort of term to kind of raise awareness of is results-based accountability. This is coming out of the work of racial equity. It's a data-driven approach to essentially do the same thing that we're talking about with performance reports and OKRs, but it's a different acronym and it's a slightly different process, uses a little bit different terminology, but it's not confusing. It's actually being very well embraced as well by staff that are exposed to our first cohort of the class. And so you may be hearing this term results-based accountability in projects that are coming to you through their updates on advancing racial equity and other program updates. The other thing I'll just say is we would love to see, as websites and for programs get updated, some reflection of the performance report. We can build custom views of dashboards and data from their annual performance report. We can provide links and snippets of these dashboards. And I think that would be another way to sort of raise awareness and exposure, is to have every program page have some link to their specific performance report cards. Next slide, please. We also wanted to intentionally describe the process of targets conversations. This is a view of the tools that are used by our Chief Deputy Director Bishop and conversations with all the division and office chiefs and regional board executive teams annually. So we go through this process and we talk about their targets they set. We look at multi-year results. We ask them for an explanation of maybe some deviations from where they said they were going to be, and their data is both directions performing better than expected, as well as performing not as well as expected. And this is because this whole process is really built around the principle of using it for setting resource planning process in place and having annual accountability dialogues. So this is just a view of that, and I wanted to explain that. So that's, I think, completes our presentation.
I just have to jump in because I know that the regional boards all love every year there are discussions that we have about their performance, but they actually are a really good chance for them to talk to me about, you know, what's happened in the region during that year, what's worked and what hasn't worked, and we talk about across regions and programs on things that have that have improved or been that are models to be thought about. And we talk a lot about ways to improve it. The mechanism for improving the targets as opposed to improving their performance is also part of the discussion. And the mechanism that we've set up for that is as people bring up issues, I turn it back to them, ask them to work with their staff in the roundtable to get a consensus on how to best document that. And then we move it usually into a performance assessment, a page that doesn't have a target with it for a couple of years. So people get used to using it and we work out the kinks and then move it to a target after it's had a little tryout period. This year was the end of a couple of years of working on a new target for enforcement that I think has been, that will show up on next year's report. And it's about how long it takes from the time you do an inspection to write an inspection report. Seems like a pretty easy thing, but it cascades to everything we do in enforcement. If you don't have that done, then you don't have the information to write an enforcement plan. You don't have the documentation to support that. And so it's taken a while, but that's where that's an example I wanted to give of the process in play that's changing the way folks work. Thank you.
Thank you for that as well. And I think there's one more slide with the names of the various team members on the report. If we can go ahead and just bring it up, just to be, give thanks.
Oh, there we go. Yeah, I'd like to point out that I don't do this in a vacuum. There are some people that are instrumental in helping get the data pulled and getting things up on the website so they show up properly. Allison Callalang has been helping with the performance reports, oh wow, for 4 or 5 years now. So she's instrumental in pulling the data in an appropriate way and getting it filtered and making sure it shows up. And as of yesterday, I was calling her in a panic because certain links weren't working. So she's been a huge help in getting these up and running properly. And then our new DIT person, Jeff Staple, has been fantastic to work with and made sure everything was up and ready to be viewed in time for the board meeting. So wonderful team to work with, and hopefully this will continue for the foreseeable future. So thank you.
Definitely. And thank you. I want to acknowledge the folks all that contribute to this as well. And you, Bev and Greg, you guys, your leadership here throughout this, it continues to make a huge difference. I'm incredibly proud of the performance report. I use it throughout the year. I continue to circle back to it because it is the best place to understand, well, what did we do? Where are we going? How are we improving the quality and management of the state's waters? And can people keep us accountable? Where can they even come and see and appreciate the continual process of improvement around it? And it's a delight to be able to have something that I can, go and clearly see where we are and aren't meeting the mark, if you will. And importantly, again, that public transparency component where it is hard to kind of know what were all those 2,000 plus staff doing over at the state and regional boards. And the answer is a lot. And there's thankfully places for folks can go to be able to see that. I know the website generally, it continues to, we're all collectively moving it toward that platform that best just easily unearths this information, helps people connect to the policies and discussions we're having. But just even the performance report section has seen a ton of improvement. And so just want to acknowledge that we continue to do as best as always with the resources we have here. And that, this effort alone is very much worth, I know, what is a lot of time to wrangle in what are a very disparate amount of data sources to come together to really give everyone the best understanding of what all we're doing. So huge thanks, and just thanks and appreciation. Board Member McGuire.
being the only other board member here, I feel strangely compelled to, oh, do we have vice chair?
We have a
Okay,
quorum
good.
still.
Very
We have
good,
a
very
quorum
good,
still.
very good. Okay. But I completely echo your comments and really appreciate the tool and the investment over 15 years and the growth that it's seen and its utility as a tool and as an engineer and someone who likes data and numbers and being able to drill down into the specifics. We could spend a lot of time doing that today, but I'm going to spare everyone that experience. But I am looking forward to improvements over time. As you mentioned, the drinking water data can be better incorporated into this. Water rights, I think, also has some room for, opportunity and incorporation and thinking through how all of our other tools that are outside the performance report that have been developed, like the SAFER tool and others sort of nest and work within this space is something I'm interested in understanding a little bit better because we have so many different places to find information and data. It's confusing to the point in certain circumstances where some of the data doesn't always align and match up, and that adds to confusion as well. So I think as we go forward, having that lens for, making sure we're being as consistent as we can with our messaging and the type of data that we're reporting. I know it's always going to be a challenge given the broad number of programs and responsibilities that we have, but thank you for just, paying attention to that. And I wanted to just ask for a moment, I've been thinking a bit about this in terms of who uses this tool, right? Who uses the performance report? We heard from Mr. Bishop and Chair Esquivel. They use the performance report and for various reasons, internal and external. But I'm also wondering about our audience, outside the water boards. Who are the stakeholders who use this tool? Are they finding it useful? Are they finding that it has the type of information that they would like to see? Or is it, or do they have concerns, or are there gaps? It sounds like the governor's office, other state agencies and programs have interest in the type of data that we have. Are they finding it useful? And so I'm just, I guess, challenging you or asking you as you're, you had the slide with the 3 to 5 year refresh. And I know you don't do any of this in a vacuum, but you're also a pretty small team. So as you're thinking about, well, what are our highest priorities? What project tasks should we tackle next? Think about that, think about maybe resetting and just getting an understanding of who the audience is, who are the users, who should the users be, and prioritizing sort of the next steps and the improvements to the reporting tool from that approach. Not that you're not doing that, but it's just, something that I think is always a good time and opportunity to do.
That's excellent feedback. Thank you. And I do think framing this as the report belongs to the whole organization is helpful too. We are the stewards of delivering the news on the report, but the hard work, and it should be on that thank you slide, really is all the programs in the regions that are doing the actual work and reporting the data into their databases and are engaging with their communities around the work that they do. And so I think that's a really good charge to us, but it's also like collectively us. It's the water board as a whole. And so I'll talk to my colleagues and supervisors about how to do that. But one example would be, I think, site cleanup program. They're really embracing not only the stuff that is in the performance report that they have been doing for years, but they have actually built up some desires over the last 10 years to update and improve their site cleanup program performance report card. And along came this objectives and key results project. And they are now using them both together. They're using the data that's part of their annual reporting, but they're also creating new measures and key result data points that they're collecting that are more meaningful on sort of like equity and short term and things like that. So it's a great example of how they are going to use this data to engage. And I think we can pilot and learn from that. But it really is, you think about it, there's 60 maybe different programs and organizations that do engagement around their work. And so we have to figure out how to leverage that, in my opinion. So we'll report back on that next year.
Yeah, really appreciate that and agree, and good points, board member. I think what we're fortunate for is as these increased, requests for information and transparency into the organization happen, we have a framework from which to continue to build and have consistency. So to your point, you don't have different numbers for different kind of ways of looking at it. We're doing our best to make sure it is consistent, even if the requests are a little different in the way they come to us. So just thank you. Vice Chair, is there anything you wanted to add?
Nothing to add, just my thanks. And I guess the only the point that kind of along the lines of Board Member McGuire about, who's using the report. I'll just comment that through the ag stakeholder groups for fees, there was, I'd say a few years ago, lack of knowledge about this tool. And I do appreciate that the team spent some time with some of the ag stakeholders to kind of walk them through how they could best use the report. And so I guess I would just suggest, additional opportunities like that. Not just waiting for folks to come to us, but maybe seeking out opportunities to, whether it's some type of training or at conferences, just teaching folks how they could best use the report. I know as one that's not terribly tech savvy, there's a whole group of folks out there that kind of hold back because they don't quite know, they're not as comfortable, maneuvering around the site. And so just looking for those opportunities, I think would be helpful. But thanks. I always look forward to the annual report and the update.
Completely agree. And thank you, Vice Chair.
Could I add
Yes,
something?
please.
I was going to say, I
Director
think
Sobek.
some folks who benefit the most from these reports don't even know they do, and they don't need to look at them directly. And I think about reporting to US EPA and that being ahead of the game and already having thought through what our objectives are and how we're going to measure them. When US EPA is sort of trying to reinvent the wheel, we can sort of help shape what their requirements are and sort of let them know what we're already reporting on and making sure that we're not devising multiple, not identical, but going towards the same, for the same purposes. And I think that we've headed off a lot of those at the pass, and we've used the information that's gathered for the report to just feed into those other reporting channels, and that's served us really well. So it's, and yet I'm pretty sure US EPA doesn't go and look at these themselves, but it's been really important for us being able to comply with our federal reporting requirements.
Really appreciate that. Yeah, that consistency across and not having to have a new, drill each time someone is looking for that very similar data. It's like, okay, we know where to go. Really appreciate those points. Anything further? Well, hearing none then, look forward to next year's report, look forward to engagement throughout this year and even anticipation of that. Just thanks incredibly. I really appreciate this work. That then wraps up item number 10 and actually brings us to the end of our 2-day agenda. We do not have a second board meeting this November, so we will all see you in about a month on December 5th and 6th at our next board meeting. Until then, be safe, be well. Thanks everyone for the great engagement over the next 2 days and look forward to seeing you here in about a month and sooner than that, many of you before. So thank you. Take care. This meeting is adjourned.